It's 1875 in central London. You're a general builder tasked with digging down to widen an area for the next underground station. It was a job you have done over and over again, and other than finding the odd bit of pottery or the occasional coin, the job was pretty simple. You start digging out the track bed when your shovel strikes something hard. White flecks appear in the dark soil, and you look down expecting a stone. What stares back is a skull. Its soulless stare appears to go through you, and in the dim light you go to turn away, except the candlelight flickers, showing more and more lumps in the soil, and you realise with horror that you are not alone down here. It sounds like a scene from a horror movie. However, the story is remarkably true. The station was Aldgate, and even more macabre is that the bodies are still there. The most famous plague to ever hit the planet was the Black Death. While its source is unclear, what was certain was that trade routes such as the Silk Road and new ships carried the plague into Europe and ultimately into England through the ports. The plague spread like wildfire and wiped out over 50 million people globally. The plague lingered for the next 300 years and would break out in pockets, especially in large cities like London. In 1665, living conditions for the poor was dire. Multiple families would have to live together in cramped wooden shacks with only a communal fire for heating and cooking. Rotten food, sewage and rubbish were left outside the house to fester. The conditions were a perfect breeding ground for rats, and with it the fleas followed. The warm weather of May brought the perfect conditions for the bacteria to spread, and the first deaths were recorded to great concern. The number of dead increased from around 3 to 43 in 3 weeks, with doctors reporting scores of sick every day. The rich and the royalty fled as soon as the pestilence hit the households, but the poor simply had nowhere to go. Worse still, if the plague was found in just one person, the whole house was placed under quarantine, including every innocent family member that resided there. As the number of victims grew, churchyards became overwhelmed. People were soon employed to push dead carts. The men would shout to families to bring out their dead, and the dead were loaded on and taken away. It was mostly at night, but as the losses racked up, day collections were also required. The dead were taken to great pits, dug as close to consecrated ground as able, and the dead were thrown in. There was no ceremony, no coffin and no flowers. There were simply too many. As the death toll grew, pits were extended before the earth covered them. By 1666, the spread showed signs of slowing, and the Great Fire helped massively by removing the old buildings and the rubbish. It was estimated that 120,000 people in London alone perished in that year. That equated to 1 in 5 of the population. But what about the bodies? The churches would have first recorded the deaths of the first victims, but as the toll increased, it was impossible to identify everyone as they were brought in on the carts, the exception being those in some form of power. Pits would have been dug in haste to bury them, but there would have been no marker or map to say where the pits were. If there was, it would either have been lost when the diggers died, or, if on paper, was lost in the fire. As London expanded, the pits would have been built upon, and centuries of urban development would seal them away. That was until the London Underground came in. The men were digging near the church when they came across the site. The pit was between 9 to 20 foot deep, 16 foot wide and 40 foot long, and contained over 1,100 skeletons. The men were shaken, but there was nothing they could do. So after taking notes, measurements and counting the number of people buried, the pit was again covered and the superiors ordered the build to continue. It may seem a heartless move, but burial overcrowding was still a problem. There was also the unknown. These people had died of a terrible bacteria, and many thought that moving them would unleash the plague again. But Aldgate isn't the only station to play home to the dead. Crossrail workers working at Liverpool Street Station got more than what they bargained for when the ground started to stare back. It was more unnerving that the area had been the site of the former Bethlem Hospital. Over 3,500 bodies had been discovered on the former hospital cemetery, but adjoining the site, a second unknown pit was found. The 30 or so bodies were laid on top of one another, and according to archaeologists, they were most likely plague victims and were buried in basic coffins. As the wood rotted, the bodies fell through into the pit. A single headstone was found nearby, just with the date of 1665. Meanwhile, at the London Road depot on the Bakerloo line, you'll see twin tunnels. One tunnel is very respectable, running live to Lambeth and the Elephant and Castle, but the other is the aptly named Dead End. It is known as a runaway tunnel that was designed for train runaways. A wall greets anyone who dares to enter, but on the other side are thousands of bodies, much larger than the one found at Aldgate. But a lot goes on in a station. People busying about, minding their own business, rushing to work or just visiting. But Aldgate in particular, while to many isn't as striking as some, but to the staff, the station is one of the most extraordinary on the network. Almost on a daily basis, reports come in of ghostly footsteps when the platform is empty, or concerned passengers seeing people dressed in nothing but rags. But when they check the platforms, the person was gone. The most famous, though, is the spectral lady. The legend goes that a railway worker was working near the station when he fell and made contact with the live third rail. Almost 20,000 volts of electricity surged through him, knocking him out. As the people raced to the scene from the platform, they saw a woman in white, sat by the man stroking his hair. As responders approached, the woman disappeared. The man survived, however he had no idea who the woman was and insisted he was alone. The hauntings are so frequent at the station that the staff keep a logbook of occurrences. Liverpool Street Station also has a few ghostly goings-on. CCTV controllers have reported seeing men on the platform despite the station being closed. Staff and security are sent to search, but again no one's found. There have been screams heard around the tunnels, unnerving even the most hardy of people. The culprit was a victim of the treatment from the former asylum. She had an unusual obsession with a coin, and when she died, the coin was stolen from her. She now roams the station, which inhabits the site, searching and screaming for her beloved coin. But these are just a handful of stories and encounters in just 2 stations. But with new pits being located as we dig deeper, more and more stories will come to the surface, and with it, those we unintentionally undisturb will possibly walk the earth again.